It had started long before that night in the hotel suite, long before I found myself stirring tea while pretending that my thoughts weren't dragging me into a past I had sworn to forget. There was a time when my life followed a different rhythm, one built on careful decisions, controlled risks, and an unshakable sense of direction. I had been the kind of man who set goals and met them with precision, never allowing emotion to interfere with logic. Business was my domain, and I had mastered it. But love had been a lesson in destruction. Even before my marriage crumbled, I had begun to sense the slow erosion of something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't the grand betrayals that signaled the end. It was the small things, the missed glances, the rehearsed apologies, the moments where silence spoke louder than words. I'd convinced myself that compromise was the key to longevity, that if I simply adjusted my expectations, I could hold on to the illusion of stability. But illusions don't last. And when the truth finally surfaced, it left behind a void I had no idea how to fill. I threw myself into work, into wealth, into distractions that numbed rather than healed. And yet, despite everything, despite the distance I had placed between myself and the pain, it followed me. While idly preparing dinner in my luxurious hotel suite, I found myself deep in thought, reflecting on the twists and turns my life had taken. I had told myself countless times that I had moved on from my ex-wife's infidelity, that I had left the pain behind. But the truth was, the scars were still there, buried beneath layers of denial. No matter how much time had passed, the betrayal lingered like a ghost I couldn't shake. My therapist once compared my emotional state to post-traumatic stress disorder, a suggestion that initially left me feeling frustrated and, frankly, insulted. How could the devastation of a broken marriage be equated to the horrors of war? The idea seemed ridiculous, even offensive. I wasn't just taken aback, I was embarrassed. It made me feel weak, as though I lacked the resilience to handle something as ordinary as infidelity without unraveling. But after months of therapy, I had to accept the reality. Trauma affects people in different ways. There was nothing shameful about my struggle, or at least not enough to justify the guilt I carried. Still, to ease my conscience, I had donated $1 million to organizations supporting veterans battling PTSD. Maybe it was my way of making peace with a comparison I had once rejected. Regardless of the reasoning, one thing remained clear. I wasn't about to give up on therapy. That said, when it came to my therapist's advice on relationships, whether it was about settling down again or simply engaging in casual flings, I didn't exactly take it to heart. I had decided that my own hand was the only thing I could truly rely on. It wouldn't betray me, deceive me, or leave me broken. For now, that was enough. As I absently stirred my tea, I forced my thoughts away from the unease and insecurity tied to my ex-wife's affair. Instead, I focused on what lay ahead. You've got a whole life in front of you, I reminded myself. You're only 34, not bad-looking if the way women at the office react is any indication. And most importantly, you're wealthy. That last part was undeniable. Money had never been an issue. I'd been born into privilege but hadn't coasted on my inheritance. Taking my grandfather's company, I had expanded it exponentially, acquiring new businesses and turning them into gold mines. So, why was I incapable of applying that same strategic mindset to relationships? The thought unsettled me. Why did I hesitate around women now? Had my ex's betrayal left me afraid? Before I could get lost in that downward spiral, the doorbell chimed, cutting through my thoughts. Yes, my suite was so extravagant that it had a doorbell. I glanced at my watch. Right on time, I muttered, making my way from the bedroom, through the grand hallway, to the door. One of the few things that had brought me genuine fulfillment since my divorce was philanthropy. My latest initiative was supporting Escort to Success, a Seattle-based nonprofit dedicated to helping homeless women reintegrate into society and the workforce. My assistant had arranged for me to meet with their outreach director, Chris, but thanks to a dead phone the day before, I had completely missed the email with the meeting details. I knew nothing about this Chris person. No background, no experience, not even a full name. I figured I'd learn everything over dinner and during my visit to the organization the next day. When I opened the door, I was caught off guard. Standing in front of me was an undeniably stunning woman. I had assumed Chris was a man. Clearly I had been wrong. She appeared to be around 30, about 5'8", but well over 6 feet in her heels. She was effortlessly elegant, dressed with just the right balance of sophistication and subtlety. Her presence was commanding, her curves accentuated by the perfectly tailored dress she wore. "Are you Brad?" she asked, her voice smooth, carrying an almost hypnotic depth. "Brett," I corrected her, flashing a small smile. "Brett Connor." I extended my hand, noticing the brief hesitation before she took it. Her grip was firm yet soft, a mixture of confidence and grace. "You're with Escort to Success, right?" I prompted. She nodded. "That's right." "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let her through. Chris entered, her gaze sweeping over the suite. Though she tried to play it cool, I caught the flicker of appreciation in her eyes. As she commented on the decor, it became clear that she had an eye for art, maybe even a passion for it. "Can I get you a drink?" I offered, making my way toward the bar. "A vodka martini would be nice," she replied, still subtly taking in the surroundings. As I mixed the drink, we exchanged a few polite remarks. I even mentioned the incredible view from the bedroom, easily the most striking feature of the suite. She followed me without hesitation, standing by the massive window, gazing at the city lights. Slowly, she began to remove her shawl. "Not just yet," I said with a smirk. "We'll talk business over dinner, not here. Let's finish our drinks and head downstairs." She raised an eyebrow but went along with it. We wrapped up our drinks in the sitting area before making our way to the elevator. "I hope you're okay with a farm-to-table restaurant," I said as we stepped inside. "I'm sick of steakhouses and pretentious fine dining." "Works for me," she replied, her tone unreadable as we crossed the lobby. As we stepped out of the building, something unusual caught my attention. She almost seemed to anticipate that I would take her hand. It wasn't something I typically encountered in professional settings. Back in Chicago, business meetings were strictly hands-off affairs. Maybe things operated differently in Seattle. Approaching the entrance, I turned to the doorman. "Is the limo here?" He nodded and motioned toward a sleek black limousine idling a few feet away. As it pulled up, he opened the door for us, and I slipped him a crisp $20 bill. His face brightened as he thanked me. Since my divorce, I had developed a habit of tipping generously. It was one of the few indulgences that made me feel good. Chris and I made small talk during the ride, covering everything from Seattle's politics to the latest sports headlines. She seemed impressed by the limo, and when I offered her a drink from the well-stocked bar inside, she accepted without hesitation. Upon arrival, the driver quickly stepped out to open the door. As Chris extended her long, toned legs while stepping onto the pavement, I caught the brief widening of his eyes. "Pick us up in 2 hours," I instructed. He gave a small nod and touched the brim of his cap before getting back behind the wheel. As expected, we were given the best table in the restaurant. That didn't surprise me, but Chris's intrigued expression did when she caught me discreetly slipping the maitre d' a folded $50 bill. Her eyes flickered with curiosity, though she chose not to comment. Once our wine and appetizers were ordered, I leaned in slightly. "How long have you been with Escort to Success?" A warm smile spread across her face. 4 years? "And have those 4 years been good ones?" I asked, genuinely interested. She hesitated briefly, as if surprised by the question, then replied, "It's fine. Not as fulfilling as my previous work in the art world, but after the industry took a downturn and I got laid off, I couldn't find another job. I had bills to pay, and I'm raising 2 little girls on my own." She explained that before switching careers, she had been involved in the arts, a field she clearly had a passion for. Now she was a single mother, with no father figure in her daughters' lives. "Do you make more now than you did in the arts?" I asked, sensing an underlying implication in her words. She paused, looking momentarily unsure of how to answer. "Yes," she eventually admitted, though her response seemed oddly uncertain. I leaned back, studying her face. "What are your primary fundraising methods for Escort to Success?" This time she looked completely bewildered. Her brow furrowed, and after a long pause, she said, "Brett, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I don't think we're on the same page." She was about to elaborate when her phone vibrated against the table. She quickly retrieved it from her clutch and checked the screen. Her eyes widened. "I need to take this," she said abruptly. She answered in clipped, efficient sentences, but then her expression shifted dramatically. "Holy crap," she muttered under her breath. She muted the call and locked eyes with me. "You didn't happen to book an escort named Tammy tonight, did you?" I frowned, completely lost. "What are you talking about, Chris?" That was the first time I had addressed her by name. She smirked, tilting her head slightly. "My name isn't Chris. It's Tammy." She let the revelation settle before breaking into a playful grin. "Brett, I don't work for a charity. I work for an escort agency. I was supposed to meet a guy named Brad in room 2901 at your hotel. My confusion deepened. Wait, what? I'm the only one in 2901, and I definitely didn't book anyone named Tammy. She glanced at her phone, her expression shifting from disbelief to amusement. Oh my God, she laughed, shaking her head. 1901, not 2901. I really need to work on my handwriting. She turned back to me, still grinning. Well, since I'm already here, mind if I stick around for dinner? I was still piecing everything together, but after a brief pause, I chuckled. No problem. Just let me borrow your phone when you're done. I need to make a call myself. She nodded and returned to her conversation. I'll call you tomorrow, B, she murmured into the phone before hanging up. Handing me the device, she smirked, and I couldn't help but laugh along with her. What were the odds? I dialed my philanthropy coordinator's number. The first 2 calls went to voicemail, likely because she didn't recognize the number. On the 3rd try, she picked up, her tone cautious. Hello? Dawn, it's Brett. My phone's out, so I'm using a borrowed one. Have you heard from Escort to Success? Yes, she said, sounding relieved. Christopher Thompson called about 20 minutes ago. He mentioned that he was running late and that you weren't in your room when he arrived. Suppressing a laugh, I replied, call him back and let him know I'll be at their office tomorrow at 11 instead of 10. We'll have to skip lunch. Something unexpected came up. Use this number to confirm. Got it, she responded, clearly flustered. I returned the phone to Tammy. When Dawn calls back, just answer and tell her I'm under the weather. Take the message. I smirked. This is going to make for an interesting office visit tomorrow. Tammy chuckled. All right, Joker. A few minutes later, Dawn called back, and Tammy answered with a deliberately sultry voice. After hanging up, we both burst into laughter, struggling to finish our appetizers before the entrees arrived. With the mix-up now behind us, the tension evaporated. The conversation became effortless, the mood light, and for the first time in a long while, I was actually enjoying an evening out with a woman, without nerves, without expectations, without overthinking everything. As the night went on, I couldn't help but take a fresh look at Tammy, or rather Susan, which she revealed was her actual name. And she wasn't just gorgeous, she was charismatic, sharp, and genuinely fun to be around. I was charming too. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity of the situation, or maybe it was because, for once, I wasn't pressuring myself to be someone I wasn't. Whatever the reason, the usual anxiety I felt in social situations had vanished, at least for tonight. By the time we wrapped up dinner, more than 2 hours had passed. Without my phone, I had no way to reach the limo driver, so I stepped outside, scanned the area, and quickly spotted him parked a short distance away. With a simple wave, I signaled him over, and as he pulled up, I handed him 2 crisp $100 bills. His face immediately brightened. Appreciate it, sir. Back inside, the restaurant staff didn't seem to mind us lingering a little longer, likely thanks to the generous tip I had left earlier. When we finally got up to leave, Susan reached for my hand, giving it a soft squeeze before leaning in and pressing a delicate kiss against my cheek. This is the best time I've had in ages, she murmured, her voice carrying an emotion I hadn't expected. Her eyes glistened slightly under the dim restaurant lighting. I met her gaze, sensing there was more behind her words. It's been a long time for me too, Susan. But what's with the tears? She let out a quiet sigh, shaking her head with a small, wistful smile. Because despite everything, you treated me like I mattered, like I was someone you genuinely wanted to spend time with. I frowned slightly. Why wouldn't I? Everyone has their own talents, their own worth. I have my strengths and you have yours. That makes us equals. For a moment, she just looked at me, then her lips curled into a playful smile. She leaned in again, brushing another kiss against my cheek before murmuring, I'd offer you a freebie, but my nanny expects me back by midnight. As I held her gaze, taking in the mischievous glint in her eyes, the sultry smile, and the effortless confidence she carried, something clicked inside me. I wanted her, not just in a passing way, but with an intensity I hadn't felt since my divorce. That realization shaped my next words. If I send another $200 to your nanny, can she stay overnight? Susan raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering across her face. Without missing a beat, she pulled out her phone, dialed a number, and spoke casually. Cheryl, plans changed. If I throw in an extra $200, can you stay the night? Yeah, I'm serious. Perfect. Call your mom. If I don't hear back, I'll assume it's a yes. She hung up and turned back to me. What time do I need to be home? 10, I answered without hesitation. She smirked. 10 it is. Without another word, she made another quick call. Mrs. Johnson, can you come by earlier tomorrow so I can get the girls to school? There's extra money in it for you." She ended the call and looked at me with an amused expression. I raised 2 fingers. "Another $200 for her, too." Susan laughed lightly. Then, after a final brief conversation on the phone, she slipped it back into her purse and grinned. "All right, let's go." As we slid into the limousine, she leaned in closer, her voice taking on a sultry edge. "I haven't given anyone a freebie in years, but I am actually looking forward to this. My rules, though." The slow smirk spread across my lips. "That's fine. Just know, I plan to take my time with you, and I promise, you won't forget this night." The ride back to the hotel was smooth, the driver grinning as I slipped another 100 into his hand. By the time we reached my suite, we could barely keep our hands off each other. In the hallway, her back pressed against the door as I kissed her deeply before effortlessly lifting her into my arms and carrying her inside. What followed was pure indulgence, an intoxicating mix of passion and pleasure so consuming that for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. Not even with my ex-wife, someone I had once loved, had it ever felt this electrifying. Susan was more than just stunning. She was skilled. She did things to me I hadn't even imagined possible. 3 rounds between midnight and 8 in the morning, and still I wasn't satisfied. Despite barely sleeping, neither of us felt drained the next morning. If anything, we were still riding the high from the night before. We ordered breakfast in bed, then took a long, playful shower together before the food arrived. When the waitress brought in our order, her knowing smirk made it clear she could guess exactly what had gone down. The $20 tip I gave her only widened her grin. In the morning light, with her damp hair cascading over her bare shoulders and her face free of makeup, Susan was even more breathtaking than she had been the night before. We laughed between bites of food, stealing kisses and playful touches, neither of us wanting the moment to end. As she got ready to leave, since she needed to be home by 10, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I saw things clearly. "Susan," I said, watching as she adjusted her dress, "is there any chance for something real between us?" She paused mid-motion, staring at me like she wasn't sure if she had heard correctly. At first, I thought she might laugh it off, assume I was joking. But as we rode in the limousine toward her house, she realized I was completely serious. "Why would you ask something like that to a call girl 4 years older than you with 2 kids to raise?" she asked, shaking her head slightly. "I mean, sure, I know I'm incredible in bed, but come on, really?" I leaned forward, holding her gaze. "In the last 14 hours, I've learned more about you than most people get to know in months. And I like what I've learned. I don't care about your past. I care about what happens next. You made me feel more alive than I ever have, and that includes every billion-dollar deal I've ever closed. Nothing compares to how I felt with you." She studied me carefully, as if trying to gauge whether I was just feeding her a line or actually meant it. I took a breath and continued. "I have a plan. I haven't thought it through completely, but I know the first step. How much are your monthly expenses?" Susan still looked stunned, but recovered quickly. "About $6,500, she admitted. "All right," I said, pulling out my checkbook. "Let's try something. Take a month off. A real break. I'll write you a check for $13,000, double what you need so you don't have to worry about money. During that time, we'll go on actual dates. I'll meet your kids, and we'll see if there's something real between us. No expectations, no strings attached. The money isn't for anything. It's just so you don't have to stress over bills while we figure this out. What do you say?" She blinked at me, her expression unreadable. "You're actually serious, aren't you?" "As serious as a heart attack." For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, slowly, she glanced from me to the checkbook in my hand. "A month," she murmured. "What do I have to lose?" After a brief moment of hesitation, she reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and pressed a speed dial number. "Hey, Bia, it's Tammy. Listen, can you find someone to cover my shifts this week and make sure I'm off the schedule for the next 31 days? I'm taking a sabbatical. And if Simon has a problem with it, remind him that I have other options." She paused, listening to the response. "Great, just confirm with me before noon. Thanks." As she ended the call, I smirked. "You know, I still don't even know your last name." "Susan Collins," she said, flashing a smile. I scribbled out the check and handed it to her. She stared at it for a moment, almost as if trying to convince herself it was real. Just then, the limo rolled up in front of her apartment. I pulled out my money clip, peeled off $400 bills and pressed them into her hand. "This is for your nanny and Mrs. Johnson," I said with a grin. Without hesitation, Susan leaned in and kissed me softly before stepping out of the car. As the driver held the door open, she turned back, her eyes twinkling. "Be here at 7 tonight. I want you to meet my daughters over dinner." "I wouldn't miss it," I assured her. She shot me a playful smile before heading inside, swaying her hips just enough to make sure I noticed. That morning at Escort to Success, I struggled to focus. My mind kept drifting back to the night before. Still, I managed to absorb enough about the nonprofit's mission to be genuinely impressed. Their work was meaningful, and I respected what they were accomplishing. So much so that, before leaving, I quietly donated $250,000. The gratitude from the staff was overwhelming. Before I left, I pulled aside one of the employees, a woman with a young daughter of her own. "Quick question, what do 6- and 7-year-old girls love getting as gifts?" She rattled off a few ideas and even pointed me toward a store nearby that was sure to have them. By late afternoon, I had a dozen pink roses for Susan and 2 carefully chosen gifts for her daughters. Nothing extravagant, just something thoughtful to make a good impression. At precisely 7 p.m., I knocked on the door. It swung open to reveal the most adorable little girl I had ever seen. She was dressed in a neat little outfit, a bow perched on her head, her bright eyes filled with curiosity. "Hi," she said politely. "Are you Mr. Connor?" I smiled warmly. "That's me. And what's your name?" "I'm Misty. I'm 7. She tilted her head, studying me intently. "Do you like my mom?" Before I could respond, Susan appeared behind her, laughing. "Careful, Brett. Anything you say can and will be used against you. Misty is definitely future lawyer material." She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, her eyes softening when she saw the roses. Meanwhile, Misty and her younger sister Beth eagerly unwrapped their gifts, their faces lighting up with excitement. Any reservations they might have had about me melted away in an instant. Before long, the 4 of us were in the kitchen preparing dinner together. Well, mostly the girls were. I was quickly learning that Misty had appointed herself the director of operations in this household. By the time we sat down at 7:45, it felt like I had known them forever. Dinner was lively, thanks to Misty's endless stream of questions. Some were amusing, some a little too insightful. Then came the one that caught me off guard. "You know, Mr. Connor," she said, pausing with her fork halfway to her mouth, "Mom never has men over for dinner. She must really like you." Susan nearly choked on her drink while I let out a laugh. "Let's just say she pleads the 5th on that one." Beth scrunched her nose in confusion. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm choosing not to answer," I replied, flashing a smirk. Susan shook her head, clearly entertained, and we continued eating. The food was excellent. After dinner, we all pitched in to clean up, and it was obvious Susan had raised her daughters well. They took their tasks seriously. As we chatted afterward, I took in my surroundings. Susan's apartment was simple but elegant, every piece of decor carefully chosen. She had an eye for aesthetics, no doubt a remnant of her past in the art world. Eventually, it was bedtime. Susan sent the girls to get changed, and a few minutes later, they reappeared in pajamas, ready to wind down. Beth hesitated for a moment before approaching me, clutching a book to her chest. It was Dragons Love Tacos. "Will you read to me in my room?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Susan started to protest. "Honey, Brett and I are about to have an adult conversation. He doesn't—" "I'd love to," I interrupted, giving Beth a reassuring smile before looking at Susan. I caught the surprise in her eyes, quickly followed by a look of approval. Misty tugged at her mom's sleeve. "Will you put me to bed then?" Susan smiled and nodded, leading Misty to her room while I followed Beth into hers. The book was hilarious, but what made it even better was Beth's commentary. She had memorized the whole thing. Whenever I stumbled on a word or misunderstood an illustration, she was quick to correct me. When we finished, I leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Good night, Beth." As I moved to turn off the light, her small voice stopped me. "Are you coming back, Mr. Connor?" I chuckled. "You can count on it, sweetheart." When I returned to the living room, Susan was waiting with 2 glasses of wine. She handed me one, sighing dramatically. "I hope you weren't too overwhelmed." I took a sip and shook my head. "Not at all. I was flattered. I've always wanted kids, but I left my ex before we ever had any. Your girls are amazing." Susan's expression softened. "They're my world." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping our wine. I complimented her on dinner, her decor, and the warmth of her home. Then I set my glass down. All right, Susan, let's plan the next couple of days. I can only stay in Seattle until the day after tomorrow before I have to head back to Chicago. She swirled her wine thoughtfully. Aside from my daily 90-minute gym session, which I never skip, and getting the girls to and from school, I want to spend as much time with you as possible. I need to see if you're really serious about this, about us, and if a relationship between us could even work. Her voice was steady, but there was unmistakable curiosity in her gaze. And honestly, I'm wondering why a man like you, a billionaire, would be interested in me, and how your friends and family would react. I shrugged. I don't care what anyone thinks. For the next 2 hours, we brainstormed ideas, mapped out plans, and structured a schedule that worked for both of us. Between discussions, Susan would playfully nudge my shoulder, catching me whenever my gaze wandered. "Eyes up here," she teased. "Stop staring at my chest." A few minutes later, she smirked. "Now you're looking at my thighs. Cut it out." I grinned, unbothered by the reprimands, and kept sneaking glances when I could. By 10:45, we had everything finalized. As I stood up to leave, Susan grabbed my tie, pulling me into a deep, lingering kiss. Her lips barely parted from mine as she murmured, "I'd love for you to stay the night, but I have a rule. I never bring men home while my daughters are here unless it's something serious." I chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I respect that." And I meant what I said. This month isn't about Zex, though I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't take the opportunity if it came up. This is about figuring out if we have something real. Her lips curled into a smile. "I'll see you tomorrow at 10. We've got a gym session, remember?" She kissed me again, slow and intentional, before I finally stepped into the waiting limo. The next morning, I arrived at her apartment at 9:35. When she opened the door, already dressed in a sleek workout outfit, I nearly forgot my own name. Somehow, she looked even more stunning than she had the night before. Her eyes dropped to the small bag I carried. "You actually brought a change of clothes?" "Of course," I smirked. She nodded toward the limo parked at the curb. "Tell your driver he's off duty today. I'll handle our transportation." I did as instructed, then slid into the passenger seat of her Prius. I grinned as I buckled in. "So, eco-conscious, huh?" "I have 2 daughters. I want to leave them a better world," she replied with a smile. When we arrived at her gym, a man and a woman stood behind the reception desk. The moment they saw Susan, their faces lit up with recognition. "Hey, stranger," the woman greeted. The man, who I assumed was the owner, gave her a respectful nod. "Haven't seen you bring a guest before." Susan turned to him. "Yeah, I wasn't sure about the policy." "Does he need to pay?" The owner chuckled. "For you? No way." Then his eyes flickered toward me, studying my face. "Has anyone ever told you that you look a lot like Brett Connor?" I let out a small laugh. "I get that a lot, but from what I hear, Connor owns his own gym." He grinned, shaking his head. Susan, however, raised an eyebrow at me. "Wait, you're not just wealthy, you're famous too?" I shrugged. "A little, mostly in business and environmental circles. One of my companies was the first in the world to achieve a completely neutral environmental footprint. The Wall Street Journal and the New Yorker wrote about it recently." Her expression turned amused. "Funny, because last night you mentioned arriving in Seattle on a private jet. How exactly is that eco-friendly?" I smirked. "Every time my plane is in the air, my company buys an acre of land in the Amazon or Canada and plants trees on it. So, technically, I leave a positive impact." Her features softened with admiration before she leaned in and pressed a kiss to my cheek. "All right, I'll allow it. Now, let's get to work." Over the next 90 minutes, I learned 3 important things. First, Susan wasn't just into fitness. She was an absolute machine. Her workout routine was no joke. The way she moved, the way she pushed herself, it was clear she had been at this for years. It was no surprise she had a body that looked sculpted by a master artist. Second, she was even sexier when she was sweating. Third, I wasn't the only one who noticed. Nearly every guy in the gym stole glances at her. Some tried to strike up conversations, others blatantly stared. She brushed off every single one. One particularly persistent man approached, flashing an easy grin. "Hey, Susan, been a while. Want to grab a smoothie after your workout?" Without breaking stride, she shot him a polite but firm response. "Sorry, I have to finish my training and then get to work." She didn't even look back at him. I smirked to myself. She might have stumbled into my life by accident, but I had no intention of letting her slip back out. By the time we wrapped up our workout, I was thoroughly exhausted, but somehow I had kept up. As we walked to her car, I turned to her. "Aren't we showering here?" Susan smirked. "Nope, I don't like the rules here." I raised an eyebrow. "What rules?" "We can't have sex in the showers." She wasn't joking. Back at her apartment, the second we stepped under the warm water, my fatigue evaporated. Every single muscle in my body might have been sore, but the moment she leaned forward, all I could think about was her. It was, without question, the best sex of my life. Later that afternoon, we got tested for STDs, a move I deeply respected, before spending the rest of the day exploring Seattle. We walked through Pike Place Market, took the ferry, visited the Space Needle, and wandered through a quiet park. As we reached a scenic overlook, Susan suddenly stopped walking, turning to me with a serious expression. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly. I met her gaze. "Okay. What is it?" She hesitated before continuing. "There are two things I wasn't completely upfront about when we first met, and one more thing we haven't discussed yet." I nodded, keeping my tone even. "Go on." She took a breath. "First of all, I hate my job. I hate everything about it. When you asked if I enjoyed it that night, I dodged the question because the truth is I only do it because I have no other choice." Her voice wavered, but she didn't look away. I exhaled. "That makes sense." She seemed surprised by my calm reaction, but pressed on. "Second, I wasn't entirely honest about why I lost my job in the art world." She swallowed hard. "I was accused of stealing from the gallery I worked at." I stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue. "I didn't do it," she said firmly, "but I was fired anyway. I had to drain my savings and take on debt to hire a lawyer. Even after the charges were dropped, no one would touch me. My career was dead." She exhaled shakily. "I spent months unemployed, drowning in bills, worried sick about how I was going to take care of my daughters. Eventually, I became an escort." I processed her words, my expression unreadable. "And the third thing?" Susan hesitated again, then dropped her gaze. "Their father, my ex-husband, died when Misty and Beth were 2 and 3. He was reckless with money, left me with nothing, and his life insurance was $5,000. That's all." She let out a hollow laugh. "The girls don't even remember him. They have no male figure in their lives." Finally, she lifted her gaze back to mine. "So, if you want to take back your check, your offer, or just walk away, I won't stop you." I sat in silence for a few moments, processing everything. Then I met Susan's eyes and said, "I don't want the check back. I still want to move forward exactly as we planned. If it's all right with you, I'd like to run a background check myself, just for my own peace of mind. But unless you turn out to be a serial butcher, I doubt it'll change anything." She stared at me, her expression unreadable for a few seconds, then suddenly broke into a grin. Instead of shaking my offered hand, she pushed it aside and kissed me. That evening, we picked up her daughters from school and spent the night together as a family. The next morning, I ordered an expedited background check. A week later, the results came in. Everything Susan had told me was true. The only thing she hadn't known was that the real thief, one of her former co-workers, had been identified. He had fled the country, which explained why the charges had quietly disappeared. When I told Susan, she was relieved, but also furious that no one from her old job had ever informed her. Friday and Saturday were nothing short of incredible. I managed to handle a few business matters remotely, but most of my time was spent with Susan and her daughters. We did a mix of simple everyday activities, most of them free, but anytime there was an expense, I covered it without hesitation. Beth, in particular, had become extremely attached to me. Whenever we walked anywhere, she insisted on holding my hand, as if she had already decided I was part of her world. On Sunday morning, all 3 Collins women accompanied me to the airport. Misty and Beth hugged me tightly, and Susan kissed me, passionate, but trying to be discreet. She failed, of course. The girls giggled as I walked away, whispering to each other like we couldn't hear them. The following week, I convinced Susan to find a babysitter and fly to Chicago for a few days. Despite my wealth, my home wasn't an extravagant mansion. It was comfortable, sophisticated, but not excessive. The only exception was my art collection, which Susan immediately gravitated toward. I could tell she appreciated the restraint in my lifestyle. She stayed from Tuesday to Thursday, and although the nights weren't as wild and adrenaline-fueled as our first together, they were even better. The closeness between us deepened. It meant something now. While I was at work, I made sure she had a driver and access to any art galleries or exhibitions she wanted to see. I even pulled a few strings to get her private viewings of collections that weren't open to the public. The following week, during a phone call, I suggested she bring Misty and Beth to Chicago for a visit. "But they have school," she protested. "And their school doesn't allow unexcused absences. This could be bad for them. And for me." I chuckled. "Susan, the saying, 'money can't buy happiness,' is absolutely true. But money can buy almost everything else. Give me the director's name and number." With some reluctance, she provided it. One phone call later, their absences were excused, and the school even prepared all their assignments in advance. In return, the school received a brand new, state-of-the-art audiovisual system. Misty and Beth fell in love with Chicago. The energy of the city fascinated them, and they adored the parks, museums, and activities. The trip was filled with moments of laughter and excitement. Even though Susan and I maintained the illusion of sleeping in separate bedrooms, and even though our bed life was considerably tamer with her daughters in the same home, I still wouldn't have traded the experience for anything. On Saturday, I decided to take a significant step, one Susan was hesitant about, but ultimately agreed to. We were going to meet my family. That meant my socially elite parents, my younger brother and his wife, my favorite cousin and her husband, and their children. It wasn't going to be an easy introduction, but if Susan and the girls were going to be part of my life, they needed to meet the people in it. To ensure Susan felt confident, I bought her an outfit that perfectly balanced elegance and allure. As for Misty and Beth, they were given free rein to choose their own dresses, completely ignoring every suggestion Susan and I made, of course. Susan was effortlessly charming, Misty was full of curiosity, and Beth was adorably quiet, but observant. Overall, the evening went better than I expected. The only awkward moments came when my brother's wife, my cousin, and my cousin's husband teased their spouses for paying a little too much attention to Susan. On Sunday, we went to my parents' country club. I didn't personally belong to one, never saw the appeal, but I visited occasionally, and Misty and Beth had begged to swim in the heated pool. Susan chose a simple, modest one-piece swimsuit, something I was immensely grateful for because, had she worn anything more revealing, at least 2 older men might have suffered cardiac episodes on the spot. The day was going perfectly, until trouble arrived. My ex-wife, Carrie, walked in with her parents. Carrie was the perfect embodiment of the sweet, bubbly girl-next-door type, cheerful, charming, and seemingly harmless. But underneath that polished exterior was a woman who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. Her parents and mine had never truly understood why I ended things. Thanks to a mutual infidelity clause in our marriage contract, the details of our divorce had remained private. Carrie never admitted to what she had done, and I saw no reason to enlighten anyone. Whenever someone asked why we split, my response was always the same. Ask Carrie. Because of this, my family had never fully accepted my decision. Worse, I had recently heard from mutual acquaintances, and even my father, that Carrie had been talking about wanting to reconnect with me. I ignored every mention of it, but today, seeing my parents greet her warmly, as if she hadn't destroyed our marriage, sent a fresh wave of irritation through me. I kept my distance, making sure to avoid any direct interaction with her. Thankfully, Misty and Beth were determined to keep my attention focused solely on them. They insisted I watch them swim, giggling as they took turns retrieving objects from the bottom of the pool while Susan swam her laps. By the time Susan and the girls had finished swimming, she took them to grab lunch at the diner, while I stretched out on a shaded lounge chair, enjoying a few quiet moments to myself. That peace didn't last long. "Brett!" A chirpy, all-too-familiar voice rang out as Carrie appeared beside me, practically bouncing with excitement. I barely looked up. "What do you want, Carrie?" My tone was flat, my expression unreadable. She pouted dramatically. "Don't be like that, Brett. I told you I was sorry." I finally met her gaze, unimpressed. "Oh yeah? When exactly did that happen?" "In all the letters I sent you," she huffed. "Since you never answered my calls, my lawyer personally handed them to yours." I smirked. Didn't read them, but I made sure they got recycled. Wouldn't want to contribute to unnecessary landfill waste. Her mouth fell open. "What?" I didn't bother repeating myself. Undeterred, she launched into a rambling monologue as if she thought she could wear me down. Her tone turned whiny as she said, "You made such a huge deal out of nothing." Before I could deliver the scathing response that was forming in my head, salvation arrived. Susan and the girls walked up, each child holding an ice cream cone while Susan balanced 2 colorful cocktails. Perfect timing. I turned away from Carrie mid-sentence. "Susan, I'm so glad you're here. I want you to meet someone who was just leaving." I gestured toward Carrie with the kind of polite dismissal that only made it more insulting. This is my ex-wife, Carrie. Carrie's eyes snapped to Susan. As she took her in, her entire demeanor shifted. Even in a simple one-piece swimsuit, Susan was effortlessly the most attractive woman at the pool, possibly anywhere. Carrie inhaled sharply. Is this your new girlfriend? I grinned. No, my fiancée. Her face crumpled, and before I could even enjoy the sight, she burst into tears and ran off. Susan handed me one of the umbrella drinks, knowing full well I hated them, and sat beside me, her expression unreadable. For a full minute, she said nothing. Then, in a tone so monotone it sent a chill down my spine, she finally spoke. I don't recall you proposing, or me accepting, or, a ring. I suddenly felt like an idiot. Susan, listen, I stammered. I just needed to get rid of that disaster as fast as possible, and unfortunately, that was the first solution that popped into my head. I'm sorry, what can I do to make it up to you? She narrowed her eyes. Tell anyone she tells, and anyone who asks, that it was a lie. Done, I agreed immediately. And a 30-minute back massage tonight. No funny business until it's completely finished. Understood? Got it. Susan didn't say anything else. And when the girls returned, the moment passed, and everything went back to normal. But that night, I delivered on my promise. 30 full minutes. No distractions. What came after? Absolutely worth it. Even though I was exhausted, I felt a surprising pang of disappointment when Susan and the girls left early Monday morning to return to Seattle in time for school. Any doubts that she was still annoyed about my fiancé comment disappeared when she kissed me goodbye, slow, deep, and lingering. Misty and Beth, on the other hand, were openly miserable about leaving, pouting the entire way to the airport. I was set to fly to Seattle on Wednesday evening. Until then, I called my 3 favorite girls, Susan, Misty, and Beth, every night. On Wednesday afternoon, while I was tying up some last-minute work, my assistant buzzed my office. Sir, your father is on his way up. I frowned. That was unusual. I ran nearly every aspect of our companies, so if my father ever needed something, it was typically resolved over the phone. That said, this wasn't entirely unprecedented, so I didn't think much of it. The moment he arrived, he didn't bother knocking. He never did. We exchanged a quick, firm hug before he closed the door and took a seat across from me. Son, he began, his voice unusually serious. We need to talk. I sighed. Let me guess. Carrie? I've spoken to the Smythes, her parents, and your mother. We all think you should consider giving Carrie another chance. I stared at him. You can't be serious. Listen, I know you think... No, I interrupted. I know this isn't happening. End of discussion. He exhaled sharply. Look, I understand you're fascinated by this woman, Susan. She's... How do you know she's older than me? I snapped, my tone suddenly sharp. Because no one could tell just by looking at her. My father didn't even blink. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, smugness creeping onto his face. That's something else I wanted to discuss. I had her background checked. I felt my blood start to boil, but I kept my face neutral. She's 38, he continued. She's been a call girl for the last 4 years, and before that, she was arrested for stealing artwork from her employer. I didn't flinch. My voice was calm. And? For the first time, his confidence wavered. You knew? He stammered. You knew this, and still... Yes, I said flatly. I knew from the moment we met, and if she wants to marry me, I will marry her. His face turned a deep shade of red. But you can't, he sputtered. What will our friends say? I leaned forward, my voice dropping to something far more lethal. First of all, I said, my tone icy, none of your friends will know about her past unless you tell them. Secondly, if you do tell them, and if I have to choose between them and the woman I love, you already know who I'll pick. And third, I gave him a slow, sharp smirk. I don't give a damn what your friends think. You can't talk to me like that, he barked. I stood up, walked to the door, and held it open. I just did. His jaw clenched. If you're finished, I added, get out of my office, and be very careful about who you share that information with. He stormed past me, his face still red with anger. The moment my father stormed out of my office, I grabbed my phone and dialed my mother. She answered after 3 rings, her voice warm as ever. Brett, how's my favorite son? I skipped the pleasantries. Mom, I know Dad went behind my back and ran a background check on Susan. A brief silence followed before she responded in a carefully neutral tone. I had no idea he did that. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Come on, Mom. You're the one who calls the shots in this family. There's no way he would have done that without at least running it by you first." She didn't deny it. "I mean it, Mom," I continued, my voice unwavering. "If Susan agrees to marry me and you and Dad force me to choose between her and this family, I will choose her." And before she could respond, I ended the call. Despite my father's interference rattling me, I finished my work and made it to the airport on time. By the time I boarded my jet, I had calmed down enough to think clearly. This was a fight I was going to win. When I landed in Seattle, Susan and the girls were already waiting for me at the private terminal. The sight of them instantly melted away any lingering frustration. That evening, I took them out for dinner, read Dragons Love Tacos to Beth, who had memorized every word, and later, after the girls were asleep, I poured drinks for Susan and me. She took a slow sip of her wine, watching me over the rim of her glass. "How was your week?" "Business as usual," I said lightly. She arched a brow. "Nothing out of the ordinary?" "Nothing worth discussing," I replied. Her smirk told me she wasn't buying it, but she let it go. Instead, she leaned forward slightly. "Well, I have something important to talk about. Is now a good time?" "Probably the best time," I said, setting my drink down. I took a deep breath. "Susan, while it's obvious to anyone with eyes that you're the most stunning woman I've ever met, what truly amazes me is your strength, your intelligence, and the way you've raised two incredible girls. No matter what life has thrown at you, you've held your head high, and I admire that more than I can say." She held my gaze, her emerald eyes sharp and unreadable. I swallowed. "What I'm trying to say is, I'm completely in love with you, and I want to marry you. I just don't know how you'll respond." A slow smile spread across her lips. "Interesting." Then she set her wine down and leaned back in her chair. "Before we continue this conversation, I should probably tell you about the phone call I got 2 hours ago." A sense of unease settled in my gut. "A phone call?" She nodded. "From your father." My jaw clenched. "He offered me $3 million to walk away from you," she said casually, as if she were discussing the weather. I stilled. "He also told me that someone like me would never fit into your family," she continued, "and that if you actually convinced me to marry you, you'd be cast out." She lifted her wine again, taking another sip. "So, how does that change our conversation?" The rage simmering beneath my skin was unlike anything I had ever felt, not even when I discovered Carrie's betrayal, but I forced myself to breathe. I met Susan's eyes, my voice steady. "I understand why $3 million tax-free might be tempting. That kind of money would secure your daughter's future. But I don't think money is what drives you. I think you do what you have to do to provide for your girls, and that's what I respect about you." She studied me carefully. I went on. "As for my father's threat of disowning me, if he follows through, that's his loss, not mine. What he said has nothing to do with how I feel about you." I exhaled. "So, does that change your answer?" Susan suddenly slammed her wine glass onto the table. "Damn it, Brett! You're the smoothest guy in every other aspect of life, but when it comes to romance, you're clueless." I blinked. "Excuse me?" She folded her arms. "You're never going to get my answer unless you actually propose." A long pause stretched between us. Then I stood. "1 second." I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a piece of aluminum foil, and carefully shaped it into a loop. Returning to the living room, I got down on one knee, held up the makeshift ring, and locked eyes with her. "Susan Collins," I said, my voice unwavering, "will you make me the happiest man alive, accept this highly valuable ring, and agree to marry me?" She stared at me, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Do you really think it's wise to marry a woman you've only known for a month, especially one with my history?" "If you say yes," I replied, "no one in my presence, including you, will ever refer to your past like that again. And yes, I think it's a great decision, because I wouldn't just be gaining a wife, I'd be gaining a family, a real one." Her lips twitched. "What if I'm only marrying you because you're great in bed, and my daughters are obsessed with you?" I grinned. "I'll take you for any reason." She tilted her head. "And what exactly would I do in Chicago, aside from raising my girls and, fulfilling your every desire?" "You can do whatever you want," I said simply. "I'll buy you an art gallery, get you a museum job, whatever makes you happy." She tapped a finger against her chin. "Will there be a prenup?" "Yes, with a mutual infidelity clause, but I guarantee the terms will be fair." I took another breath. "And as soon as we're married, I want to adopt Misty and Beth. If they accept me, I want to be their legal father. Each of them will have a $250,000 trust fund for their education, with you as the sole trustee." For the first time, something flickered in her expression, something I couldn't quite place. Then she leaned forward. "Would you want more kids?" My heart pounded. "I'd love one or two more. But if that's not possible, I'll still be the luckiest man in the world with the 2 daughters you've already given me." A wicked smile spread across her face as she stood, took my hand, and pulled me to my feet. She plucked the aluminum foil ring from my fingers and led me toward the bedroom. Without another word, she undressed us both. "Yes," she whispered, her emerald eyes gleaming. "Now, put this priceless symbol of commitment on my finger." I slid the foil ring onto her hand, vowing to take her to a jeweler first thing in the morning. That night, as we curled up in bed, her back pressed to my chest, I realized something. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. The next morning, we were jolted awake by the excited giggles of 2 little girls launching themselves onto the bed. "Brett, why are you here?" Misty asked, her face just inches from mine. Ever since last week, I had insisted that the girls call me by my first name, wanting them to feel comfortable before any major changes happened. "There's something really important I need to talk to you and Beth about this morning," I explained. "So, I stayed over so I could be here first thing." That answer seemed to satisfy her curiosity. Beside me, Susan stretched lazily, then shot the girls a knowing smile. "Go eat breakfast, you two. We'll be out in a few minutes." As soon as they scampered off, I turned to Susan. "So, you really meant it? You're actually marrying me?" She simply smiled, lifting her left hand and wiggling her fingers so the aluminum foil ring caught the morning light. Taking a deep breath, I said, "With your blessing, I'd like to ask the girls separately if they'd be open to letting me adopt them." Susan's eyes filled with unshed tears. "That's incredible. They would love that. I would love that." She wiped at her eyes, shaking her head. "If today wasn't a school day, you'd be getting a very special thank you for saying that." I smirked. "Maybe after they leave?" She grinned. "Maybe." Since it was still early, I had enough time to talk to each girl before school. I started with Misty. She was the more cautious of the 2. Beth had already made it clear she wanted me to be her dad. Sitting across from Misty at the breakfast table, I took a deep breath. "I have something important to ask you." She looked up from her pancakes mid-bite. "Okay." "Your mom has agreed to marry me," I told her. "And I'd really love to adopt you so that I wouldn't just be your mom's husband. I'd be your dad too, but only if you want that." She chewed thoughtfully, her gaze locked onto mine. Then a slow smile spread across her face. "If you adopt me, can I call you Dad?" My chest tightened. That's all I've ever wanted. "Then yes," she announced, beaming. "I never had a dad before, and I think you'd be a good one." I couldn't stop myself from pulling her into a hug, my throat tight with emotion. She pulled back slightly, tilting her head. "Why are you crying, Dad?" "Because I'm really, really happy, sweetheart." Susan wanted the girls to finish out the school year in Seattle before making the big move. It was already early May, and we had plenty to organize before the wedding. Since the ceremony would take place in Chicago, they would start their new life there immediately afterward. For the next few weeks, I flew back and forth between both cities, juggling work, wedding planning, and spending as much time as possible with my soon-to-be family. Susan was excited about the wedding, but Misty and Beth, they were ecstatic. The moment they found out they'd be flower girls, they were practically bouncing off the walls. "Whatever you want for the wedding, just go for it," I told Susan one evening. "What's the budget?" she asked. $500,000. Her eyes widened. "That's insane. Let's cap it at 100,000. The rest should go to charity as a wedding gift from us." She paused. "Also, no gifts. Let's list 3 charities on the invitations instead." I sat back stunned. I didn't think it was possible, but I fell even harder for this woman. Once we set the wedding date, 2 weeks after the girls' school ended, I sent an email to my parents. No calls, no visits, just an email. "Susan and I are getting married in June. If you want to attend, let me know at least 10 days in advance. However, Dad must first apologize to both me and Susan for his disgraceful phone call. If not, we will only discuss business moving forward." A day later, my parents confirmed their attendance. Susan's parents did as well. She had been estranged from them for years, ever since they discovered how she had been supporting her daughters. But, unsurprisingly, the moment they found out she was marrying a billionaire, their opinions mysteriously changed. On our wedding day, I swear Susan was the most breathtaking bride in history, and Misty and Beth, they were the most adorable flower girls I'd ever seen. The honeymoon in Aruba? Even after 10 years, thinking about it still sends a shiver down my spine. We wasted no time starting our next chapter. Our son was conceived in Aruba. Our daughter, she likely came from a trip to New Zealand 2 years later. Today, Misty and Beth are 16 and 17. They've grown into two of the most well-adjusted, intelligent young women I've ever met. Top-tier universities are in their future, and I have no doubt they'll make a mark on the world. And as for Susan and me, it's been a decade since Susan, walked into the wrong hotel room. And to this day, I am still the happiest man.
What's up, story lovers? This is the Story Guy, and if you're hungry for crazy tales and mind-blowing narratives, you've come to the right place. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our weekly dose of crazy cheating stories, fun fiction and gut-ripping comedy from around the world. But that's not all. We also create our own original stories, and trust me, you won't find these anywhere else. Want even more spine-tingling reads? Head down to the description and grab our exclusive story collections. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.